If you're passionate about classical education and you're looking for the next step, Hillsdale College's Diana Davis Spencer Graduate School of Classical Education is now offering 2 master's degree programs. These programs provide students with a broad philosophical, historical, literary, and pedagogical perspective on classical education. The Master of Arts in Classical Education is a 2-year, in-person program on Hillsdale's campus in Michigan, while the Master of Classical Education Leadership is a 3-year hybrid program with a 1-week summer class held at Hillsdale College. Whether you're interested in teaching, administration, or another area within the field of classical education, we're prepared to offer you a foundational, time-proven approach to your studies. We want to see your application soon. Applications must be submitted on or before December 15, 2024 for full consideration. To learn more and submit your application, visit classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu. That's classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
We continue our series of episodes from presentations delivered at Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence seminars. The Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence, an outreach of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office, offers educators the opportunity to deepen their content knowledge and refine their skills in the classroom. These one-day conferences are hosted during the academic year in cities across the nation and feature presentations by Hillsdale College faculty, K-12 office staff, and leaders in the Hillsdale network of member schools. There is no cost to attend, and attendees may earn professional development credits. Currently, the Hoogland Center is hosting a series exploring the art of teaching a variety of subjects. To learn more about upcoming events, please visit our website, k12.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome. It's very good to mostly see you. I've got lights on me, so I think I can mostly see you. And thank you for taking the time to be thinking through, as we will together, teaching and doing the common vocation of education, which is so important and essential, and I second what Dr. Kuykendall was saying. And what I'd like to talk to you today about is how I teach my U.S. Constitution class. It's one of our flagship courses at Hillsdale. It's known very much for the online version of it, but the core of it is a class we do with all of our students and part of our core curriculum. And that does affect, obviously, how you teach something. It's the only class in my department that is part of the core curriculum. So for a lot of students, it's their only in-classroom exposure to the study of politics at Hillsdale College. And therefore, also the only introduction for the department. And that means that most of the people that I'm working with, the students that I'm working with, aren't majors and won't be. They're going to be studying biology, they're going to be studying English, they're going to be studying these other topics. And so there's 2 challenges that I might not have with, that I will have with these that I might not have, say, with upper level classes. You know, I'm teaching the Federalist Papers and right now, and they're bought in, right? And that is getting students interested in the major, so interested in maybe taking other classes, but probably more along the lines of maybe what you all might be thinking through is getting non-majors interested in the class at all. I will have students come to me and say, I've been dreading taking this class, right? Or this is not what my major is. You know, this is not what got me excited about coming to the college. And so I like that challenge, though. I love that challenge. I love teaching this class. I love that there are students across abilities in relation to the college, across interests in relation to the college, across motivation in relation to the college. And so actually, I'll tell you one thing that I often start with is I'll be calling roll and I'll ask them their favorite TV show or movie. And they think I'm doing a meaningless icebreaker just to get to know them. I'm not. Now, this is getting a little harder because I'm getting older, and so the movies I'm knowing less of them, and the TV shows less of them. However, what I will start asking them, for the ones I know something about, is there any politics in this movie? And, if they picked Lincoln, right, that's easy. But I do try to show them, is there anything in this film where people are arguing about what the rules should be for how people live together or work together? Is there anything in the movie that seemed to you unjust or unfair? Something that outraged you or inspired you about how human beings live together? And almost all the movies do. I even made a case for Anchorman, for those of you who know that film, right? Workplace politics and things like that. And so I try to say, you've maybe understood politics before as campaigns and elections. But then what I'll give them, before we even do U.S. Constitution, is Aristotle. And Aristotle will tell them, politics isn't just who you vote for or what party you affiliate with. It really is what it means to live together in a community and to talk together about what you think is right and wrong, what you think is good and bad, and then to organize yourselves together in a partnership or a community built around those things. And if that's the case, all of you do politics whether you realize it or not. All of you are involved politically whether you realize it or not. And in fact, all of your careers are dependent in some ways on politics. I'll ask biology students, can you clone a human being? And sometimes they'll say yes, and my answer is no. Because actually it depends. Is it possible or might be possible eventually scientifically? Yes. It's also illegal. So politics interacts with science. Or censorship questions. Should there be censorship of certain materials? That's where politics and, say, English or other things interact. So I try to get them invested that whatever else you're going to be, a doctor, a teacher, whatever, a homemaker, all these other things, you're going to be a citizen. And you're going to have to think through what it means to live together with other people and what is just and unjust about that, what should be done or not done about that. And so that's one way I try to do it. And therefore, how do I structure when we get to the particular thing we're going to look at, which is not just politics in general, but the United States Constitution, and how the United States Constitution deals with these fundamental questions of what it means to live in a community together. And there's different ways to approach this in the way you put a course together. You could go historically or chronologically, right? You start in 1776 or even 1620 or, I don't know, year 2500 BC, right? And then you walk through it historically. You can go through it thematically. There's these questions: the right to life, liberty, property, or other questions that you could break things up with. Pardon me. I don't do either of those. I actually go textually. I use the U.S. Constitution as my outline. And why do I make that the case? Start with preamble, go through the articles, go through the amendments, and I don't go through every single clause. That would be too fast, too much. So I will tell students, by the way, when we get to Congress and I'm doing the powers of Congress, any of you who are just really excited about what it means for Congress to define piracy on the high seas, I'm sorry. Take the Congress class here, right? Maybe they'll talk about it. But I do use the Constitution as my outline. Now, what do I think is the advantage of that? It makes the focus of the course the focus of the course. If it really is a class on the U.S. Constitution and teaching the U.S. Constitution, then it becomes what is ordering everything else we do in the class. It makes everything else subservient to knowing and understanding this document. And we will bring in chronology. We will bring in themes. We will bring in history. But we will do it to say, let's not get the thing itself lost. Let's not get the text itself lost in the context, the subtext, right? The pretext, whatever else is around the text. Now, that means there are pitfalls, by the way. You do need to give students historical context, historical development in how parts of the Constitution have been understood, or when amendments came into being that modified or commented upon prior ones. You do need to show them themes that are running. So, people say history is, one darn thing after another. You don't want the Constitution to just be one darn word after another, right? You want to give them that kind of context that needs to be reinforced. So I recognize that, and I think you need to do that. But I still have found this idea of making the Constitution the primary thing very helpful. Now, how do I approach the classroom doing this? Since I think it's obviously important. Sometimes college professors, the idea is we just kind of walk in and talk, right? That's not a good idea. And I know you all know it's not a good idea for teaching, is to think about how to manage the classroom. And obviously there's differences between lecturing and discussion, and I think both can be done well. I tend to lean more toward discussion. I will give them a text. We will come in and we'll talk about the text. We'll read sections from the text. I'll ask questions about the text. And why do I go for that? Why is that at least the approach that I try to take? One is, for me, immediate assessment. If I'm just lecturing, sometimes students have really good poker faces. They can be staring at me and I'm thinking, oh, I must be Solomon-like in what I'm telling them right now. And it's more that they're thinking about, can I get tickets to the Taylor Swift tour, the Eras tour, right? And sometimes, and some don't, some have, less poker faces, but I can kind of immediately see, is the class getting it or not? Because they have to tell me what they're seeing in the text. They have to tell me back what they're understanding in the text. That also helps me to intervene, maybe quicker. Intervene in the sense of the first time I really know a student is struggling, hopefully isn't going to be when they bomb the test or the first paper. It can also help me to modify while I'm talking what might be the need of that classroom. Sometimes I come in and I think students are going to get this concept easily. Nope. They struggle with it. Or I have this whole long developed way of going about teaching them. So I'll get to this in a second, but I never know how quickly the students are going to get the idea of incorporation. The idea that the Bill of Rights are incorporated against the states through the 14th Amendment. Sometimes I spend half a class trying to get that understandable to them. And sometimes I'm ready to do that, and in 5 minutes the class seems to have comprehended that concept, right? So it allows me to do that, and it helps me to also get them to think out loud in a way that I think reinforces what we're doing. I sort of tell them there's 3 levels of learning I'm trying to do for you here. You read something on your own, that's one level of learning. You come in class and talk to me about it, or we talk about it, that's a second level of learning. And then the third level being you do an exam or a paper where I see what can you do with it now that you've read it and now that we've had a discussion about it. So other people, I'm not saying that's the only way to go about it, but I've found that that has been, I think, a fairly effective way for getting the students involved, committed. Sometimes they're involved because they love it. Sometimes they're involved because they're terrified I'm going to call on them and expose that they didn't read, right? And that's helpful as well to do too. So that's how I approach generally going at the Constitution. That's how I approach sort of classroom management as far as going through the material. But what does it look like to use the Constitution as your outline? What does it look like to make it the text that you're primarily going through, but bringing in other things? And so I want to walk through, really my class has 3 parts to it. And the first is way disproportionate to the size of the text, we spend the first part of the Constitution course just going through the preamble, just working through the preamble. Now, why spend so much time on the preamble? It's not just that it's the beginning of the text. What do preambles do? What's their function? And what is our Constitution preamble's function? Why is it that students, if they learn any part of the Constitution that they memorize, it's the preamble? My first grader daughter, that's the one part of the Constitution she's memorized, right? That's pretty standard if you memorize any part of it. Preambles introduce what's the rest of this document doing? What's the rest of this document there for? What is it trying to accomplish? And if you can get a handle on that, then you're getting a handle on the broad principles. You're getting a handle on the broad questions that the Constitution is not just asking, but answering. And this is where I do try to tell them these major things that you maybe don't always think are political get brought up and get pulled into this question of, or the kind of things that the preamble is talking about, the fundamental questions of politics and human life. So, for example, I begin with, we the people. And I say, okay, we sometimes gloss over that and gloss over it too quickly. If it wasn't we the people, what else could have started the Constitution? And people, after I push them for a little bit, they say, well, it could have been we the rich, we the well-educated, or it could have been I the king. And why? What does we the people actually say? And you have to somewhat skip to the end of the preamble to see we the people are doing what? Ordaining and establishing this Constitution. It's actually asking the fundamental question, who rules? Who's in charge? If we're going to have a political community with rules, then we're going to have rule makers. And who should be the rule makers? And that gets us into all sorts of questions. Why would you have the people rule? And that brings us to questions that permeate the course. Do we believe human beings are equal or not? When people are different, what does that mean for human equality or inequality? And it gets us into all sorts of interesting discussions. And I'll give them additional readings where some people don't really believe that much in human equality. Some people believe in it. Some people have different ideas regarding it. And so we work those things out and discuss those things in class. Now, once we have some idea of the idea of who rules, which is what the preamble is talking about, notice the next words after we the people of the United States. The next words are in order to. And we often jump over that to the list that comes after it. But I say, what does in order to signal that the preamble is doing? It's answered who rules, but that's not enough. You need to answer an additional question, and that additional question is, for what purpose? Why rule? And by the way, that signals something to them, because I said, what if it just said, we, the people of the United States, ordain and establish this Constitution? It would basically say, you can do whatever you want. It's limitless, whatever you feel like doing. But no, we say in order to, because we actually, the Constitution actually commits us to certain principles, certain objectives, certain goals. And so then we start working through those goals. What does it mean to form a more perfect union? And that's where I like to bring in some of the debates about, first, I bring in certain Federalist papers, like Federalist 10, and say, is having one country better because of what holds us together, what's unified about us, or is it better because of what we disagree about? Or is it both? Actually, I put Federalist 2 and 10 together. Federalist 2 emphasizes how, we all agree on everything. Religion, we all agree on principles, we all have the same language, all these things. And Federalist 2 is like, you know what's great about us? Well, we're different. And how do you put those questions together? This is where I talk about the Civil War and bring up the question, what does it mean for us to be a union? And we read documents that led up to the secession. This is where I don't have time for this. I don't want to bog you all down. But this is where I use Taylor Swift, by the way, to explain the Civil War. If you want to know, I can tell someone after class. But I use Taylor Swift to explain Lincoln's argument and South Carolina's argument about secession. And it works. I'm just worried that the way I use it, eventually she's not going to be famous, and then I'm not going to be able to have this example anymore. But it brings up great questions, because what does it mean for us to be a political community? That's what the union question is answering. What does it mean to establish justice? What is justice? Where does it come from? And I'll show. And by the way, this is where you want to bring in competing perspectives. I give Alexander Hamilton's The Farmer Refuted, which my students know because of the Hamilton musical, right? But I give them a selection from that where he's saying, our rights come by nature through God and their life, liberty, and property. But I don't just give them that. That's not the only perspective in American history that has been argued. I give them people from the progressive era that say, no, that's too static. That doesn't account for the change that has happened in America. Rights really come from the development of history, the development of society, and society reacting to economic and social and other changes. And I put them up against each other, and we try to understand both arguments and discuss, where do we think each one is making a valid point? Who do you think is right? I like to force them to, think through those things. And I, by the way, usually don't tell them where I am. I mean, if it's Hillsdale, they have assumptions where I am. But that means I try to give them the best argument both ways. What does it mean to secure the blessings of liberty? That last famous one. What is liberty? Everyone's got an idea of what liberty is. I tell people there is no anti-liberty party. There's always the other side is the anti-liberty party. But that means there's competing notions of what it means to be free. And so giving them Americans who have thought in good ways about this. And by good ways, I don't mean necessarily ways I agree, but thought in ways that are helpful to work through these things. So we think about these fundamental questions about what it means for someone to rule, what we should be doing in order to have an effective government. What should government be doing in relation to this? And a thing I do like to emphasize in this part is in answering this question about what we should do in community, we're ultimately answering, what does it mean to be human? You can't really understand what humans should do together and what justice and liberty and union is unless you actually have an anthropology. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live? What does it mean to live well? And so we talk about those things. But then you can't stop there. You've set up maybe some principles, or at least I have when I do this class. But that's not all the Constitution includes. In addition to asking who should rule and for what reasons, there's a third question of politics that every system has to answer, and that is, how are you going to do it? This is why I like to lead off this section with the Articles of Confederation, right? Didn't quite work. And this is where, the students don't always love talking about the structure of the Constitution. It's a little more boring to them, but I sort of say, what road is paved with good intentions? It's not the road to utopia. It's not the road to heaven, right? And why is that the case? Because good wishes aren't enough. Good purposes aren't enough. When you tell someone, well, at least he meant well, you're usually not saying that it went well, right? And so understanding that it's not just having good goals, but good structures to make that. And you all know this. Your schools are either run well or they're not run well. Your classroom is either run well, I'm assuming, but you've probably seen classrooms that aren't run well. And it isn't merely good intentions or good goals. It's, have you set yourself up for success? Have you structured decision making? Have you structured learning? Have you structured action in a way that is effective? And that's similar with politics. What was wrong with the Articles of Confederation? What what didn't work. And so then what we do is we start looking through the first 4 articles of the U.S. Constitution. That's the next step. And ask, what were the structural things that we put in place to try to realize the goals that we were talking about in the preamble? And that's where I talked to them about the 2 main contributions that the U.S. Constitution makes structurally: separation of powers and federalism. Now, I will say, based on some of my research, I do geek out about separation of powers. So I am really trying to say, no, guys, this is really interesting. But I also realize the limits of my kids are normal. So when I come to them with this, though, I do try to sort of get them out of their actual comfort zone on this. Because I'll ask them, with separation of powers, why do you have it? And the answer they always give me is, you don't want tyranny. So you divide up power so that no one entity has it. I'm like, okay. So why 3 branches? Wouldn't it have been better to have 5 or 7 or 15? Right? And then and that sort of makes them think. Why do we have 3? Is it merely to divide up power so that you don't have tyranny? And so I start to ask them, we look at the Constitution's articles itself. And if you look at the first 3 articles of the Constitution, none of them begin with an institution. They don't begin with Congress, the presidency, or the courts. They begin with not with a power, a type of power. Have you ever noticed this? Article 1, all legislative powers herein granted. Then it talks about Congress. Article 2, the executive power of the United States. And then it talks about a president. The judicial power of the United States, Article 3. Then it talks about a court system. Now, why is that? It's because there's a theory behind it that is more than just the division of power so that we don't have tyranny, so we don't have consolidation. It's actually an argument that if you're going to have the rule of law, there are different functions in a government that are distinct by nature that a government must do if the laws are to rule. So it isn't just, let's see the powers of government, let's slice them up blindly. There is a thing called legislative power that is naturally distinct from a thing called executive power, that is naturally distinct from a judicial power. And so I try to say, that's why it's the division it is. Lawmaking is different from law executing, is different from law adjudicating and interpretation. And in reading that, and I'll give them, the French thinker Montesquieu, I'll give them the Essex Result, if anyone's ever read that came out of Massachusetts in the 1770s. And the argument is, why would you have different institutions wielding different powers? It's not just separation for tyranny again. How is Congress constructed? Why does Congress have a lot of members and 2 chambers and the presidency is just 1? Why is the judiciary for life and the others have terms? And we try to argue, what does it mean to exercise the legislative power well? And the idea that our different institutions, Congress is set up to legislate well. The executive is set up to execute well. The judiciary is set up to do the judicial power well. And by the way, that means if they tried to do the other power, they'd actually be bad at it, right? So I talk about the need for Congress to be deliberative. The executive, you don't want to be deliberative. One of my favorite things to do is I'll pick out 3 students and I'll say, we're the police department. So someone calls, their house is being broken into. The person's wielding a knife or something, and they call you. And what does the person say? And the person I'll single out who's this is being done to will say, I need help. Come. And so I'll go to our police department. I'll say, let's run this police department like Congress. Okay, I want you to write a committee report. We're going to bring in testimony. We're going to deliberate about this. Each side's going to get 15 minutes. You can reserve your time if you don't use it all. We're going to have a floor vote. If we have disagreements between the 2 sides, we're going to have to work that out. And then after all this, And then we have to take a lunch break. And so I'll say to the person whose house is theoretically being broken into, how you doing? And they're like, I'm dead. I've been stolen from, right? But didn't we think Congress should be deliberative in making laws? Yeah, but the executive power is a different animal. The executive power doesn't want deliberation primarily. It wants energy, action to enforce the law, right? And so, but you notice what I've just said here. What I'm saying here isn't about government being divided so it doesn't do bad things. It's actually about making government more efficient so it does things well. And so I try to argue, separation of powers is both a positive and a negative. It is the negative you often think of, but it's also creating institutions that actually help government do its job better because they are tailored to the task that they have been given by the Constitution. So we talk through those things. We talk through why Congress is set up the way it is, why the executive and why the judiciary do this. For federalism is often defended the same way. Yet, is there a positive argument for why there's a division between national and state governments? And the particular powers the national and state governments wield. And so we talk about what does it mean to do things as a country together? What are the things you would want the country to do together that would be really bad if there were 50 different ways of doing it? And so we talk about, and this happened under the Articles of Confederation, what if every state had the power to declare war or negotiate treaties? What kind of mess would that be? What kind of danger would that be to our safety if that's the way things could happen? On the other hand, though, what's the advantage of federalism or of state-level solutions? I have students often that are from the West. And if you're out in Nevada or parts of California or New Mexico, water rights are a huge issue. How do you deal with issues of transporting water to places that don't naturally have it and other things? We're in Michigan. There's a creek or a river or a lake every 5 feet, it feels like, right? So how do you have solutions and things that are tailored to those parts? And trying to get them to think of the powers in relation to who would be the best to wield them. So we do that and go through that. So in making that, I hopefully can give them some buy-in to the question of how to, or why these structures matter. And how these structures are, if you really are invested in government doing just things and not doing unjust things, if you're really invested in whatever definition of liberty you've come to, or justice or good from the first part of the class, you better be thinking about how to accomplish it in the second part. And then we get to the third part, which ends up, you'll see why, being often my students' favorite, and that's the amendments. And that's where I try to bring together the first two sections of the course. The principles of the preamble, which often come up in different ways in the amendments, but then also the structures, because we spend part of our time talking about free speech, is it good or bad, or what are the limits on it, or the Second Amendment with gun rights, or free exercise of religion or establishment. But then the other question often becomes, who should be doing this, right? And this is where we get into, I joke with them, I say, this is where we get into, we've gotten past all the controversial stuff, so now with the amendments, we're going to talk about non-controversial stuff like role of religion in public life. This is where we talk about abortion and the definition of marriage and guns, and we always end, by the way, I always end with the Eighth Amendment. And cruel and unusual punishment, because I say, where better to end a class than with death, right? The death penalty, right? And discussing those sorts of questions. And so what we do is we walk through sort of the big questions that the amendments bring up. This is where I bring in the 13th Amendment and slavery. And I will actually lay out for the students all sorts of positions Americans have taken, first on whether slavery is good or bad, and then also on whether the Constitution itself is pro or anti-slavery. And I'll actually use Frederick Douglass twice for this. 1849, Frederick Douglass, where he's like, I'm anti-slavery and the Constitution is a pact with the devil because it's pro-slavery. And then I bring in a reading from 1860 Douglass where he's still anti-slavery, but he's changed his mind and says the Constitution is anti-slavery. I'll bring in Alexander Stephens in his cornerstone speech where he says, I think slavery's great, but we need to secede from the Union because the Constitution's anti-slavery. I'll bring in people who say, all sorts of these different views and have them wrestle. And I especially take time for slavery because I say, if you are going to have an opinion on America good or bad originally, or even America good or bad now, just or unjust, you have to answer the question of slavery. You have to wrestle with the existence of slavery and the racial element that was a basis of it and what America has done in response to it. I bring in, again, these other questions about abortion, marriage, these other things, but it's trying to get them to see the real-life buy-in of what they did in the first two sections. And one way this comes together, by the way, is we just did the abortion cases I did with my students. And they're kind of surprised when I give them Supreme Court cases that the argument on the court is not is there an unborn child's right to life versus a woman's right to liberty and bodily autonomy? It's actually a woman's right to liberty or bodily autonomy versus federalism, the state's power to act, and whether the court should be involved at all. So I say, do you see how we're involved in a question of justice and we're involved in a question of structure? What is right and just, and who should be making that kind of decision? Who's the decision maker within the political process for that? And so we work through these things. And this is often where some of our conversations get the most heated and debated. And this is also, by the way, where I get most creative, at least I hope with my paper topics. I will give them a paper topic, you're the Attorney General of the United States. There have been a series of terrorist attacks that we don't know where it's coming from. President Biden wants to suspend habeas corpus unilaterally, so basically make it so there's no judicial process for the people that he arrests. Write an Attorney General opinion telling him whether he unilaterally can suspend or not. I'll give them a Supreme Court abortion opinion where they have to basically uphold or strike down Roe v. Wade or now Dobbs or these other things. And get them to sort of think in real life terms about what's happening with these things. All right? And after this, obviously we haven't covered the whole Constitution. We've usually covered, with the amendments, I cover the 13th and 14th, parts of the 1st, the 2nd, parts of the 5th, parts of the 8th. So there's all sorts of other things one could include. But my hope is that gives them an idea about how to think about what else is there in the Constitution. It's given them not just content, but a way to think through the content that we didn't get to. And so this brings me back by the end to talking about them why maybe they should care about this, even if I've gotten to the end of the course and they're not all going to be politics majors, which of course they're not. And I bring back not just the fundamental questions, but I bring Aristotle back in. And I say, I left out one element of what it means for a political community to exist and to do politics. And that is from Book 8 of Aristotle's Ethics, where he says, politics isn't merely about transactional justice, contractual justice, or getting what you want. Ultimately, at its best, it's a form of friendship. It's a form of friendship among people who share goods in common, ideas in common, life in common. And I said, we have done something like that in this semester, hopefully. Class after class, living together with these documents, talking together with these documents. We have formed a kind of little polis, a little community for this semester. And that hopefully you can see that as a way of how your partnership in your community, your state, and your country would be. And can we think about cultivating citizenship and politics as a kind of friendship together? And so that's what I leave them with. And leave them with the principles and the structures and the applications as a way of forging and maintaining, hopefully, those bonds of friendship with citizens. And my hope ultimately is really to do three things when I do that. My hope is to equip them, yes. Inform them, yes, they know things. They're equipped to be part of the political community that is the United States of America. But I hope also to inspire them a bit. Students can get pretty jaded, and sometimes they're jaded because of their life experiences, hard home circumstance, hard family circumstance. Sometimes they're jaded because they decide that's what it means to look smart, right? Sometimes it's because they struggle with the state of how they see the country, regardless of which way they see it. And I try to inspire them that no, there is something good here. There is something worth engaging here. And this is not merely something you had to check off your box as a core class. This can really be understanding yourself as a human being and understanding yourself as a citizen. And that is a great task and comes back to what we're all doing together. Whatever you are teaching, the idea that we are cultivating human beings and citizens. We are helping them to learn the project of self-government. We are engaging their minds and hearts so that they themselves can take up this great task of being Americans or being part of America. I think it's a noble task, it's a frightening task in its importance and dauntingness, and I just want to say thank you all for what you do for this, in this. There's no way that when students come to me that I can be effective if you all haven't been laying the groundwork. There's no way that I can take them to wherever I'm trying to take them if you all haven't been unknowing and unseen partners in this greater task. And so thank you for that. Thank you for taking the time to do this and think through this. And we're at 15 minutes to go. I would like to certainly entertain any questions you might have, any discussion you might have, and how to think about this, because to be honest, this has been very unnatural to me. This is not how I do a classroom. So I'd love to have a conversation with you as well and thinking through how we can be the best we can for our students and for our fellow citizens in this question of teaching the U.S. Constitution. So thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this lecture, we encourage you to visit our website, k12.hillsdale.edu, for additional information on upcoming Hoogland Center events and other free resources for educators.